Brilliant. I believe we appear to be live streaming. Hello, folks. Welcome
Mhm.
to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. It's good to be with you this evening. I'm your host for the evening, Mike Finn, aka Punk Academic, and with me is my good friend John Bigger, our comrade, who is going to talk us through some of the anarchist takes on the politics of the day and the news stories that we've been looking at Freedom over the last week or so. Without further ado, John, I think it's fair to say one balk's particularly large today, which is that in the UK, for the UK viewers and for those interested abroad, we have a by-election today, don't we, John?
We
Do you want
do.
to fill the viewers in on the skinny on that one? What's going down?
Yeah, sure. I suppose. Well, first of all, hello. And yes, nice to be here again. And I think one of the surprises I've had this year is just how wild British politics has been. I mean, it's been wild for years, but I kind of thought it might be a sedate start to the year. But then, of course, it's amazing how all of these things are linked up. But of course, we had the revelation that Peter Mandelson had given information of a sensitive nature decades ago to Jeffrey Epstein. That came out from the documents released in America. And we then had questions over Keir Starmer's judgment in making him ambassador in the first place, which a couple of years ago, was it a couple of years or just a year ago? Since time goes quick.
I know, what was it Wilson said? A
Was a
week's a
year.
long time in politics or something like
Yeah,
that. Well, yeah,
absolutely,
yeah, it feels that way that year.
absolutely astonishing decision in the first place. Anybody who's observed Peter Mandelson's career could see that there would be problems down the line. Obviously, you couldn't possibly predict the problems that have emerged. And then, of course, there was the blocking of Andy Burnham standing in the by-election today. Keir Starmer clearly fearing Andy Burnham getting into Parliament and then mounting a challenge against his leadership. That needs to play into this. And then, of course, we had Anna Sarwar, the leader of the Scottish Labour Party, calling on Keir Starmer to resign, and that backfiring, the cabinet coming out to defend Keir Starmer, which is basically a stay of execution rather than Keir Starmer getting stronger, in my opinion. I haven't really seen much along these lines, but my view is that he's a weaker prime minister in the sense that back in July 2024, all of those people around the cabinet table owed him for their position because he'd appointed them, and now he owes them for him continuing in his position. And so there's going to be tensions down the line. He basically has to do things that the cabinet want now, I think, behind the scenes, and we will find that out over the years. So that's the background into today's Gorton and Denton by-election, a seat in 2024 that Labour won with ease, got over 50, just over 50% of the vote. Reform came second with 14%, and the Greens came third with about 13%. And we have a by-election. Normally, they are incredibly unpredictable anyway, and the media are talking about this being a three-way tussle between those three parties. Um, a lot of people will watch that. We know that a lot of people watch this not live; they watch it later in the week or whatever. So the chances are people watching this will already know the result, which is good for them. So I'm not going to try and predict the result. Let's talk about the various. I think the Greens are going to get it. Oh, I've done it. I've done it now. It's a mistake. I've done it. Um, uh, I think they are, but I'll tell you what.
I've just put milk froth all over my keyboard. So thanks for that,
I don't
John. I
know if
appreciate
everybody
you.
else will see that. I saw that. But, yeah. Um, it's not our job to predict, but I think there are reasons for feeling as though reform perhaps aren't going to do as well as people are fearing or predicting, just in the makeup of that constituency. Um, the Gorton part of the constituency is very different from the Denton part. The Denton part is predominantly white, and other lots of residents are kind of older. And the Gorton part, I understand, is ethnically diverse. Quite a lot of Muslim voters, And I would have thought the Greens are going to have a good chance there. Of course, there is a risk that what actually happens is the left vote is split between Labour and the Greens, and that allows reform to come through. So that's a possibility. But let's have a think about what happens in any of the scenarios that are possible. Labour wins, then it delays that drip, drip, drip effect on Keir Starmer's head. The at some point he's in trouble, and it will end up going back to all of the Peter Mandelson stuff. I don't think he's escaped that. Everybody associates it with him. A little bit like, I think it's a little bit like Partygate. Boris Johnson didn't go because of Partygate, but everybody thinks he did. If you ask people what was his downfall, it's Partygate. Of course,
Yeah, I mean, because it was a very specific thing about allegations made against a member of the government that he'd been aware of and so on and all this sort of
that's
stuff.
right. Chris
That was
Pincher.
it, Chris Pincher,
Yeah,
which everyone forgets now. Everyone just thinks it was Partygate. That
yeah.
became, as you say, that's been the narrative that's fixed now. That's what people
Mm.
associate it with. Yeah, absolutely right.
I think the same is true of Keir Starmer in that people will associate him forevermore with appointing somebody he should never have appointed. Um, so if Labour win, then it solves that problem in the immediate term. But next week, next week is the spring statement. So Rachel Reeves gets to stand up and either make us all happier financially or even more miserable. We know how that can go. So that's the next thing that crops up in less than a week's time. And then if we fast forward to May, there's the local elections. We've had the fact that the government has had to do a U-turn on stopping some of the local elections. It doesn't look good, does it? So, lots of people won't be prepared for them. Lots of councils won't be prepared for them. The candidates won't have prepared for them properly. It's all sorts of difficulties with getting that off the ground and running properly. Obviously, those results can go bad and probably will. Unless Labour do really well today in Gorton and Denton, maybe it has an impact, maybe, but I'm not sure that it will everywhere. And then you've got the elections for the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament. I think that they are going to be bad for Labour. The SNP is looking strong again, having been roundly defeated at Westminster in 2024. They look strong. Reform are looking strong there. Who knows what's going to happen in Wales? They've got a new electoral system as well. They've got more seats up for grabs. It's going to be very proportional, so it'll be interesting to see what government emerges from Wales as well. So lots of possibilities that are potentially difficult for Labour coming down the line. But obviously, winning Gorton and Denton when everybody expects them to lose or have a very tough time would be, a chance for the cabinet, the leadership to get on TV and say, well, we've done it. We're turning the corner. Have you noticed he's obsessed with saying he's turning things? During the election campaign, it was, we're turning the page on Tory chaos or whatever. Now it's turning the corner, or we've turned the page or whatever. Anyway, so we'll see what he's got to say if they win. If the Greens win, then I would say there's a chance that is going to boost the Greens nationally in the polls and increase the chance of them taking some solid seats in the local elections. They have also, north of the border, they've been working with the SNP at times. If the SNP are short of a majority, then they can fill the gap there as well. So there's a chance for the Greens to become a real force, actually, at least in polling before the next general election. And obviously, if Reform win, Matt Goodwin becomes an MP.
Yeah.
And listening to what he had to say, the BBC have got a little 1 minute manifesto from each of the candidates, and his was basically typical reform stuff. It was vape shops, barber shops, dog whistle, racism, basically, not allowing people from outside the country who are criminals to have houses before British people. It was just basically horrible stuff.
And
So
just if I can jump in there for a sec, John,
yeah,
we obviously we're of a certain age, right? So we can think back 10 years, right? And for folks who maybe aren't so familiar with Matt Goodwin, and for folks who are, who remember Matt Goodwin, 10 years ago, Matt Goodwin was not the figure that he is now, at least in terms of the way he was being portrayed. He was Professor Matt Goodwin. He was seen as a sage when it came to things like Brexit and the rise of the radical right and all this sort of stuff. He was very well respected academically. He had a Cambridge University Press book, which is a big deal if you're an academic, on Brexit with a couple of collaborators and so on and so on and so forth. And now look where he is. And of course, the thing I'm trying to draw out from this is actually, if I don't think Matt Goodwin has actually changed dramatically from 10 years ago in terms of his views. I think those views were always essentially there. I think the issue is it shows you how easily taken in the centre was by people like that 10 years ago. Oh, it's legitimate concerns. Oh, it's this. Oh, it's that. And this is where it ends. This is where it ends. This is where it really comes out with the kind of stuff, as you've said, that has been articulated in that 1 minute manifesto. Cambridge University Press book 10 years ago. Now the 1 minute manifesto that just lays it out. So, for a long time, those sorts of ideas have been laundered through, kind of, intellectual work, if you like, within the academy and treated with respect that maybe they didn't deserve, dare I say. So he's I find him a kind of almost a metaphor or an allegory for what's happened in British politics over that
mm,
time. You've gone from a point where this stuff has to be dressed up in a particular language to now we'll just come out and say it. This is what we mean.
yeah,
This is what we think we're going to say.
yeah,
And I think when you come back to your point about who could win in this seat and what the outcomes are for Labour,
mm,
um, I've heard a lot of people on the left, some of our iteration as in anarchists who obviously were not involved in electoral politics, so we're in a strange position vis-a-vis other people. But other people who are interested in parliamentary politics or socialism through that route, they are saying, a lot of them, that, well, Labour would prefer to lose to Reform than to lose to the Greens. And the narrative, the argument that's being made is if they lose to Reform, um, perverse though this may sound, it still narrativizes the main threat is from Reform. Now, Starmer's strategy to defeat Reform is failing, but nonetheless, the main threat is from Reform. And also, it means that, and I forget the name of the person I was interacting with on social media, so I do apologise, but the person who was interacting with me on social media today made the very good point that it also comes back to the man you mentioned earlier, Peter Mandelson. This has been the Mandelson strategy since the
mm,
1980s. You vote Labour or you get something really bad.
yeah.
You get vote Labour or it's this, you vote Labour or it's that. And if the Greens win, then that Mandelson strategy is utterly discredited because actually, no, you can vote for something that you might think is better and
Mm.
potentially get it. So there's a narrative that actually they'd rather lose to Reform than lose to the Greens, which I find wild in a way, but also I find plausible. I haven't heard what people have had to say about it. I don't know what you make of it.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is wild and it is also plausible. I think what we're seeing amongst the two main parties actually is that they've gone from being broad churches, conservatism and socialism, very broad ideas, and what they have become is actually narrow concerns. The Conservatives have tried to shift towards reform, so have Labour to a certain extent, right? And but Labour, Starmer's gone further. He's like expelled people from the left. He's cut down the amount of people on the left of his party who could even stand. He took and that was under instruction almost from Morgan McSweeney and influenced perhaps by Peter Mandelson. We don't know fully, but that's the suggestion. The Conservatives, we can go back to 2019 when Boris Johnson kind of instructed candidates to back Brexit if they got into power, kind of sidelining a lot of One Nation conservatives. So both parties have become narrower. And if they lose to either Reform or the Greens, that's what it's showing. If they want to beat the Greens, if Labour want to beat the Greens, go a little bit further left. That's all they have to do. It's really straightforward. You've got a two-party system and you're allowing it to become multi-party because you're narrowing the number of people who want to vote for you. Goodness me. They never asked me, by the way. So,
Well, I think when it comes to your point about who they're chasing, the votes they're chasing, I think this is maybe even a trite point, so I apologize. It's not my original thought, but you know, you are chasing voters in many cases, reform voters, who you are never going to win. If
yeah.
you go, I mean, I think we've talked about it on this news review before, and in other times. If you go into Facebook community groups across the country, Keir Starmer is universally loathed, right? Keir Starmer is seen as part of some sort of conspiracy by many people, which, is what people talk about on Facebook community groups. They hate him. There's a universal, I'm no fan of Keir Starmer, to be very clear, but there's a
Mm,
projection onto Starmer of a lot of things that people are really pissed off about, to use that
yeah.
language. Much of which he is responsible for, but much of which is contextual, structural, predates Starmer, etc. Point being, he's chasing people who hate him, and his party are chasing people who will never vote for them. And you're in a situation then where you think, well, you antagonize people who did vote for you last time. Okay, maybe they held their nose and voted for you. Maybe they didn't really want to vote for you, but maybe they felt they had no choice. Well, the law of diminishing returns applies.
Mm,
You can only play the card. I mean, one thing I always thought about the Mandelson strategy from the New Labour era, which was very much tell the North that basically this is your only option, get with the
mm,
programme. But the quid pro quo with that was, okay, we wouldn't agree with that as finance, but you're going to get loads of PFI investment, and you're going to get a new hospital, and you're going to get a new school, and you're going to get Sure Start, and you're going to get all this stuff. And you're going to get public sector organisations cited in your areas,
mm,
universities expanded, that sort of stuff. And obviously, it was mortgage in the future because it was all PFI and it was all whatever. But nonetheless, there was some sort of deal there. Whereas now, there's no deal at all. It's just, we hate you. We hate you. We really hate you, left wing people. We really hate you, people with these concerns. Labour, to be brutally honest, in its current iteration, hates trans people, hates disabled people, hates immigrants, hates asylum seekers, hates every swathe of people, hates a fair swathe of ethnic minorities in terms of the party's policies. I'm not talking about individuals.
mm.
But then expects individuals from those groups, where possible, to vote for them. And it
Yeah.
just seems to me like, I remember when I was in the US and I was in grad school, and I was taught by a professor who was a Republican, actually. And this is everyone who's done politics knows this, but it was a real revelation to me when he said, well, when you think about a political party is a coalition of minorities, right? It comes back to your point about narrowing.
Mm,
Successful political parties bring together a coalition of people with different interests that align around something. There's
yeah.
something that brings them together in that party. Um, and that's not where Labour is now. As you say, Labour is very narrow. The Conservatives are very narrow. And in a way, going back to your point, you could argue that the Conservatives nuked themselves becoming this party, um, and Labour are basically following the same script. Just going off the same cliff, effectively.
They are, and we've got a comment saying, well, they're a right-wing social democratic party. True, they are, but I would say that in the run-up to 2024, it could have gone in multiple directions. And certainly when Keir Starmer became leader of the Labour Party, it looked like he wasn't just going to be that sort of politician. He has changed his policies, hasn't he? And so there is also this feeling on the left of politics amongst a lot of people that they've been betrayed, that it's just another politician who's come along, said he was going to do stuff, and has altered what he initially said he would do. And there's lots of watering down of policies. A year before the election, they were talking about getting rid entirely of the House of Lords and having an elected chamber. Now they're struggling to even get rid of 92 hereditary peers, which you know wouldn't cost anything, and is surely the right thing to do. We've got people that are born into position in our parliament, which is ludicrous. We've got, you could go further. We've got bishops in a Church of England, bishops, one of two. I think we're one of two parliaments in the world that have clerics automatically in their parliament. The other one being Iran. So I mean, there's just so many things that you can do which are free. Actually, don't cost a penny, but make you think, right, okay, we're getting somewhere democratically, or we're getting somewhere social democratically, maybe. It doesn't need to be quite like it is, but that's, I think, is the influence of Morgan McSweeney. And to come back to where we are with all of this and where things can go in the future, he's had this great reset of his team behind the scenes. I haven't seen that feel different yet. Um, his judgment might still be a problem, you know. So, you know, if he didn't pick the right people first time, Sue Gray, then Morgan McSweeney, getting rid of his cabinet secretary, getting a brand new chief of staff. Um, how do we know he's picking the right people this time? I mean, it's just, you know, it's just a recipe for problems down the line, I think.
I think coming to your point about faith in politics, if you like, obviously we're anarchists, right? So we have a
We are.
much different understanding of what is politically possible, what is society versus what is political. We have very different ideas on that. But if you think about, I think you're right in what you say about how people are reacting to Starmer, because Starmer has become a proxy. And again, I'm no apologist for Starmer, please, folks, believe me. But Starmer has become a proxy for everyone's anti-parliamentary democracy anger.
Mm,
I think at this point, it's become a lightning rod for that.
mm,
And I think that does mean, yeah, you got to be careful that you don't over-egg this, but I think that does mean that the system itself is very unstable. You know,
mm.
you've got this weird situation. I was talking to my wife about this yesterday. You've got this weird, she's a libertarian Marxist, by the way, folks, so we're proof that socialist pluralism can work. But she's verging towards anarchism now, I'm telling you. But basically, we were talking about it yesterday, and one of the issues, you know, this is a vibes thing. But with a party with this level of majority in an ordinary set of circumstances would go the full term, maybe call an election on its own terms, as with Blair in 2001 and again in 2005. So not go the whole 5 years, call one a bit earlier at a time of their choosing because they're in a strong position. Yet
Mm.
this is a party with a massive majority. It doesn't feel like it's in a strong position at all, where there's a huge degree of anti-political sentiment, but not in a good way, not in an
Yeah.
anarchist way. Um, and that Starmer has become the touchstone for that. And, you know, because basically, as you say, there's been a long, and I take the point from the commenter as well. Yeah, thanks for that. In terms of, you know, right-wing Social Democratic Party plus a change, I do agree. Labour is Labour. I
Mm.
mean, there's a pamphlet you can pick up in Houseman's, I think, which says what the Labour Party has done for us, and it's a blank pad. So I do hear what you're saying, and you know, we can go back to Rosa Luxemburg and know what right-wing Social Democratic parties have done in the past. So we know about that. So no, 100%. But um, I do think this point there is a set of circumstances here where I do think actually the British political system is in serious jeopardy because
Mm.
the level of popular antipathy to politics as it stands
Yeah.
is very big. I think the challenge to us is how do we insert our ideas into that debate? How do we get in there, and how do we actually say, well, yeah, actually, this
Mm.
politics is screwed and
Yeah.
corrupt. But how do we get it? How do we get a conversation started? And because I'm asking you this actually specifically because 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, you were part of the project to try and do that consciousness raising and so on. So just interested in how you think we intervene at this point.
Yeah. You're referring to Class War's general election campaign, I take it, right? Yeah. So I stood I stood in Croydon South against a young Chris Philp, who is now the Shadow Home Secretary for Class War, in order to just kind of shake things up a bit. And Yeah, I think I think anarchism and electoral politics has an interesting dimension, because a lot of the people who taught us initially that we should be skeptical of electoral politics were writing way before the working class had the vote. And now we're in a very different situation. We do have the vote. We can't campaign not to have it. And we can't say, well, we don't want it, we don't care. We've got it. So then what do we do about it? So I think there are times personally, and I'm happy for people to disagree with me. It's fine. There are times um, uh, when anarchists can use this to their own advantage. So class war, we're doing it for a bit of a laugh, really. But there are potentially times when people could stand for being a councillor at a local level just to get popularity for a particular campaign. Let's say they've got a housing campaign going, something. So there are ways of using the state's big day out for our own advantage. Very hard, but you need to be imaginative with it if you do it, and you also need to know how bloody awful it is to stand for election. Uh, it's pretty terrible. I mean, I had the Daily Mail on my parents' doorstep and stuff like that, and potential reports being written about me and all sorts of stuff. And one of the things that is interesting, I think, and the more I think about that coming, I've never turned that into a book, which I've often thought I really need to turn all of that into some kind of book, but I've never quite got there, partially because of ill health and stuff like that. But one of the things I think now is that class war were deliberately obnoxious during that election campaign. We were trying to be horrible to the mainstream candidates. Politics is just awful now. It is. It's like we were ahead of the curve. The mainstream politics now is just horrendous and horrific. I mean, since that election campaign, you've had the killing of two MPs. You've had just this week, Kemi Badenoch at PMQs called the Labour Party the Pedo Defenders Party, which is pretty unusual to think that the leader of the opposition of our country is accusing the government of being that. That was astonishing, I thought. I sat there thinking, this is where our politics is right now. I can't imagine that in the Parliament of John Major and Tony Blair somehow when I was kind of first getting into politics. It's astonishing how far we've gone.
Well, I mean,
Um,
I saw a post actually on social media today, and I think it's very true. In that there are politicians operating within Labour and the Conservative Party, not just Reform. Let's be very clear, Labour and the Conservative Party, who are essentially using the language of blood and soil nationalism at this point. That
yeah,
is happening. That is happening right now. And to your point about language, respect, whatever, how people conduct themselves. I remember the 2015 campaign vividly. I remember you doing it. I remember class war. There was a bit of controversy, wasn't there, within the anarchist movement, because there was this thing about should we do this, should we engage, or should we not? But which there always is, and obviously there's a right to people have right to different opinions. But I thought it was a really interesting intervention. But I think the point you make about you were horrible to people, mate, compared to the attack ads that Labour running against the Greens in
yeah,
Manchester now, if folks haven't seen them, these attack ads are like stuff you used to see in America in the mid 90s, like really horrendous stuff, stuff about, crack epidemics and, protecting women and girls, playing into that trope and all this sort of stuff. And this stuff is not based on reality. And I
mm,
think this comes, and, at the risk of being a bit naive about political rhetoric, because obviously political rhetoric is always bent reality suit its needs. I get that. Political parties have always engaged in propaganda. I get that. But I do think there's been what is really challenging. I think centrists have been very culpable in blowing the whole system up. David Graeber, actually, not long before he died, had a great essay, about this. Um, One of the things they've been very culpable in is they had no respect for the rules that they expected everybody else to follow. So
mm,
whilst on the one hand, the system might have survived a Boris, a right wing, let's use the weasel word populism, but a far right Tory prime minister, it might have survived that because people could have said he was an aberration. But the problem then is if you've then got a Labour prime minister who doesn't really care about rules either, and doesn't
mm,
really care about the system as it's constituted, and is prepared to purge people and expel people and do all those sorts of things,
mm,
then you're in a situation then when you're in a very different space, and as you say, the rhetoric can go right down the hill. No one's taking the moral high ground, and it's free for all. And that's Polanski's appeal, I think, for the Greens as much as anything else. He's just been clear, hasn't he? He's been robust in response to that. He hasn't tried to
yeah,
triangulate that. He's just said, no, that's wrong. That's wrong. This is what we're going to do,
yeah,
which, is probably the best thing he can do in the circumstances.
yeah. Just coming back to the constituency itself that is being having this by-election. The Gorton side of it, which is the more multi-ethnic side of it, has about double the population of the Denton side of it. And so, like any by-election, it's going to be who gets their vote out. Um, People are saying the turnout's going to be high, which is unusual for a by-election, but considering like party leaders have been going there and the focus on it has been very high. Maybe that will have an impact on turnout. If the turnout is very high, then it really is, it's potentially too close to call. But I called it earlier, didn't I? Silly boy.
Well,
Yeah,
I'm not going to make any predictions because
no, good idea.
I'm
Don't.
not great on that. And as you say, we also need this. We also need this cast to have a little bit of longevity. So I'll stay away from I'll stay away from the predictions game. But I'm conscious we've talked about Manchester and the kind of febrile nature of British politics for a
Mm,
little while.
yeah,
Obviously, we've got
sorry.
other things to talk about. No, no, not at all, not at all. That's it's a big thing in Britain today. And obviously, if um, if hypothetically reform were to win, that's going to be a seismic shock for British politics. If the Greens win, that will be a seismic shock in another way. I don't think either outcome will be good for the Labour Party or for the Prime Minister, as we've outlined. So things it will open up a space which will be an interesting space to be in the aftermath. But just sticking with Britain for a minute, I mean, there's a lot going on in British politics, as you say,
Mm, mm,
and but also there's some pretty profound historic stuff showing up on Freedom at the moment as well. And if folks, I don't know if folks have seen this story, but if folks are watching haven't seen the story, I would urge them to have a look at it. Helen Bainan has written a piece for us on the road process infiltration as part of the Spycops inquiry, and essentially more of the same, but also even more horrific in terms of what went on in terms of police infiltration, how the inquiry has pursued that. And for those who haven't followed Spycops too closely, it's been going on for a long time now. Um, Freedom is a core participant in the inquiry in theory, because Freedom itself was surveilled. But obviously, the key discussion that we're having here is about predominantly female activists who were abused by male police officers who were operating undercover in left wing and radical movements of the 1980s, 1990s into the 2000s and beyond. And we've got a great piece by Helen Bain on there talking about spike ops and their infiltration into the road protest movement and reclaim the streets and so on. And the thing that gets me out of this, John, to go into an extended point, is the stuff that the spike ops did back in the day has since been made legal in the last few years. So we're having an inquiry into activities that now essentially they've got a carte blanche to do in the future. And
yeah.
this gets back to the nature of the British state, really. You have this thing where every now and again you have a period of noticing, right? There's a noticing. We'll have an inquiry. We'll do an inquiry into the Iraq
Yeah.
War. We'll
Yeah.
do this. We'll notice for a minute, and then we'll make sure we don't get caught the next time.
Mm,
And although it's slightly away from the Mandelson piece, obviously that you were talking about earlier,
mm,
one of the things that really I think is very charged in this moment, is taking away from Gorton and Denton into the just broader piece about British politics, is there I think there is a almost visceral sense now amongst the public, which has taken a long time to build, that British politics is institutionally corrupt at every level. And I
yeah.
don't just mean spy cops. I don't just mean what we're seeing with the relationship between Mandelson and Epstein. I'm also thinking about the fact there's a drama out at the moment, Dirty Business, about water companies, etc., which is having a big impact on how people think about what's going on in our rivers and so on. And also, there's been a story this morning in The Guardian, and as two blokes, we probably shouldn't be the people speaking about this, but I think it needs to be flagged. There's a story in The Guardian this morning, a big investigation into the treatment of women in maternity, and pregnant people in maternity hospitals, and maternity wards, and the level of failure that they've received, but also discrimination and so on and so forth. And I
Mm,
think there's just an awareness now. There's a kind of popular awareness, there's sensibility. This country is incredibly corrupt, and xenophobically, British people often used to think other countries were corrupt. Do you think
yes.
that's coming home to roost now? Do you think there is a kind of visceral sense that the British are like, oh my God, you can't trust anyone? Do you think that's where Britain's got to?
Well, I think we've had that for a long time. I think that's fueled the far right to some extent. I wrote articles maybe in the last 10 years at some point in Freedom about this, thinking about things like the Panama Papers and the post office scandal, Hillsborough, Grenfell, MP's expenses. There's just a growing list of examples. And what the British state does generally is it handles those issues individually. It handles them badly, and then we wait for the next one to turn up. And at some point, I think we've we've got a country that could well do with a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It could do with something that where people can actually get proper justice. I don't know how that would work, but I just find the UK astonishing for the level of corruption, and I always have. But no one's willing to deal with it, and we haven't really got the politicians who are acknowledging the link-ups between the things. And if we, the Epstein thing goes to a global level. People have been warning as a kind of conspiracy theory that there's some kind of global paedophile ring at work. And sure enough, there's evidence now that there was such a thing going on. Maybe there still is such a thing going on. And how do you tackle that? How far is the UK embroiled in that? Does it go further into the royal family? Does it go further into the state? There's so much that's wrong that ultimately comes down to the rich and powerful. And in order to sort it, we're appealing to other rich and powerful people.
Yeah,
And we don't
very well
know.
put. Very well put.
We
That's
don't
exactly what we're
know.
doing.
We
Mm.
don't know what sort of scandals they're involved in because they haven't emerged yet. So, at some point, something might give. But, at the moment, I think people are just, um, I don't think there's anything to kind of coalesce around to make a forceful statement. It's
Yeah, and
all,
and that's when you get to something like reform. Obviously, I can't get into the individual motives of the individual reform voters. I can't get inside their heads. But you know, throwing a brick through a window in a sense, is something that as an appeal at times for some. And I think with respect to reform, it's just an option to do something that will blow the system up, basically, or they think it will. And of
mm,
course, that's very similar to MAGA in the US. Obviously, the consequences of that then become awful and da da da. But just on that point about international corruption, international issues and so on, or international ties, really. One thing I bang on about a lot, and I apologise to viewers if I bang on about too much, but is Britain's status sort of as a vassal state to the US anyway. Obviously that relationship that has existed since the Second World War, but in a kind of denial, this special relationship as they call it. We're now in a situation where I'm based, everyone knows I'm in East Anglia. Where I'm based, we've got US fighter jets going over every day because war in Iran is looming. US fighters have been deployed to
mm,
Lakenheath, where US nuclear weapons have been deployed over last summer, and so on. And there's no democratic accountability to this. There's no discussion of this really in the media. Um, the best intelligence you can get is the plane spotters who are telling you who's landing and so on. They're
mm,
obsessed with it. But the
mm,
point I suppose I'm trying to get at is, we have, as you've alluded to, you have the Epstein files that have come out as far as they've come out, as far as they've been allowed to come out. So obviously they're heavily redacted and selected. And at the same time, someone who has an enormous amount to lose from those files potentially becoming fully public is at the head of a drive to wage war in another country in the Middle East. And it looks like Britain will follow merrily into that as it usually does. But I'm not seeing, like, if you think back to the big period before the Iraq War in the UK, there was popular opposition to the Iraq War. And I
mm.
think, the mood of the country was against the war. Um, but I'm not even seeing a positive case being made for war in the UK or anything like that. It seems to be very much be an issue of the US are going to do this and we're just going to support them with whatever they want to do, essentially. That seems to be, insofar as we're getting anything out of the government, what is coming out of the
Yeah.
government. It's just
Yeah,
almost like we're sleepwalking into it.
yeah. It's been like a drip drip effect again,
Yeah,
like I
yeah.
described on Keir Starmer's leadership. For the last 4 years, I would say, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've kind of had this sense that we're closer to war. The media have kind of talked it up, preparing us for it. Often, when it first started, I was thinking, why are they saying this?
Yeah,
Well, I wish people would talk about the prospect of peace more and kind
yeah.
of build that up as a possibility. It'd be a bit nicer, wouldn't it? Um, but but we're not in that sort of media landscape. I mean, I just found the start of that war 4 years ago absolutely horrific. How all of the Western media went there. They were perched on a hotel roof overlooking Kiev, and clearly hoping to get footage of Russian tanks coming
Yeah.
in or missiles exploding or whatever. And then when the war didn't turn out like that, a few weeks later they all came home again, and suddenly the news was presented from a studio again. It's like it's sick the way our media
Yeah.
deals with um, aggression like that. They want to show the pictures of, each time you see a missile blowing up, there's people there.
Yeah.
that are dying in that. And yeah, live on Sky News. Great. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember Sky was particularly, just in terms of coverage, I remember Sky was particularly bad for that. I think they've had Michael Clark on ever since
Oh
as
yeah.
a running person, pointing at the maps and
Sorry.
so on. But I remember Deborah Haynes, who I think was at the Times and been with
Mm,
Sky and so on, defense editor. I remember during that period they were desperate to find stuff, and
yeah.
there was a crashed Sukhoi jet fighter, for those who don't know what that is, near Kyiv. And they're saying Ukrainian air defenses have shot this down, and we're going to go on. And somebody has possibly died in this aircraft, but we're
Mm,
going to go and video this aircraft and so on. And I think it was like only a long time ago in a former life before I became who I am now. I was a plane geek, right? So one of the things I'm looking at the plane, I'm thinking that's not a Soviet aircraft. Sorry, Soviet. There you go. So my age, that's not a Russian aircraft. That's or it's a Russian-made aircraft, but that's a Ukrainian aircraft that's
mm,
been shot down. With some giveaways, some of the writing on it is in English so that NATO people can read. So
yeah.
the so and it was just the desperation, as you say, that voyeurism. That it's Michael Parris is a scholar of the First World War, very good book he wrote called Warrior Nation. Um, he calls it the pleasure culture of war.
Mm,
That's what this is, and it's like
yeah.
you sit at home with your Doritos and you watch people die, and that's
Mm,
and I agree with you. I think the last 4 years we've been gradually getting acculturated
yeah.
to, well, war is inevitable, and nuclear even to the use of nuclear weapons. There's a book.
Yeah.
Apologies, I forget the author, but there is a book out at the moment which you can get in Smithson service stations. Nuclear war, a scenario, and it's
Mm,
like, why are we thinking in this way?
yeah.
For whatever its merits or not, the Cold War, you could see that it was the world that it was, and these powers existed. Why are we thinking like this? Why are elites pushing us to think like this? It's
Mm.
very disconcerting to say the least.
Yeah, and Trump has been obviously there was some missile strikes on Iran, weren't there, which Israel were responsible for. Was it last year or the year before? And Trump has been talking up a conflict with Iran, particularly when the protests were really on their kind of at their peak, telling the regime that if they killed protesters, he would attack Iran, which of course he didn't. So that's helpful for the protesters, isn't it? That that is a lot of people would have maybe not taken heart, but would have thought, right, we've maybe got a chance here. Um, and the regime was able to put down that protest so brutally, and forcing families of people who were killed to kind of line up and try to identify victims through video footage and photos and stuff. A lot of people will have seen a lot of horrifying stuff, um, and the USA was no hope whatsoever. And part of this, of course, is about Iran's relationship with Russia too, and it's all kind of horrific, really. So whether we see Trump actually attack Iran or not is who knows what goes on in his head. Who knows? But we've got a level of international instability that is perfect for people to start talking about war, isn't it?
Yeah, and we can talk about to use a phrase coined by a former American president, a Republican president, 80 odd years, how long ago was it? 60 odd years ago. The military industrial complex. Obviously
Yeah.
there are arms firms do very well out of war, and a lot of politicians are involved with arms firms. So there's a lot of connections there. But I think going to your point about the geopolitics of it and the connections in Iran and Russia, I mean, I think that's obviously a solid issue for the US,
Mm,
but not necessarily in the way it traditionally has been. Because in the
yeah.
past, obviously, that'd be something the US would want to destabilize. Now, the US is much more benign posture towards Russia, but a more
Mm,
hostile posture towards Iran, which is an interesting one to navigate for them. But as you say, there's no telling what Trump will do. Is that you've got this aircraft carrier stuck in the Mediterranean at the moment. If anyone wants an amusing story about US imperialism, the toilets are broke, apparently. So apparently it doesn't smell great on this aircraft carrier. So we can take some solace from that, if nothing else. There's a lot of media apparently about the toilets having broke. So yeah, they'll have to suffer that. But you've got this metalhead in East, you've got fighters here that are being fueled and for whatever. So something may be about to happen, but maybe not, as you say. But if
Yeah,
it does happen, Britain will just wander into it as what it is, really, without
yeah.
really much debate or discussion.
We've also got Russia using tankers across the oceans for their own, for their own supplies of oil and stuff as well. And some of them go through the channel. I saw this on Sky News, incidentally, and they were talking up the idea that at some point Britain is going to have to confront these vessels. Who knows how Russia responds to that, and who knows what I don't know what that means. What are they talking about? Are they suggesting that we're going to intercept these vessels and send them somewhere else, or who knows? Who knows?
You
But anything,
fire his shots across the bow and escort them into Portsmouth Harbour. Yeah, there's a good Nando's in Portsmouth though, so I mean it's not all bad. If you get impounded in Portsmouth, you'd be laughing. But
mm,
other restaurants are available. But yeah, no, I agree, and I think I think the other thing about the British media is obviously it gets very hyperbolic very quickly,
yeah,
and it likes to believe that it's able to do things that it isn't able to do. So British military power, I think, is fairly limited. So we'll see. I think Britain is very well capable of being gotten into trouble,
mm.
but I'm not sure Britain's very is in a great strategic position to get itself out of that.
It's
Just moving.
interesting. Oh, sorry. Can I
No, no,
just
please,
as what
please.
you were saying earlier about how 10 years ago the media was kind of in a slightly different place. One thing I think is true is that the mainstream media is largely conservative and they think they're normal. They think that they are not. So there's a large section of people who are conservative who just think they're normal and everyone else
Yeah,
is different. And so putting out conservative messages is not ideological to them. They just believe that they're right.
yeah,
And so, we've seen kind of two things over the last 10 years. We've seen that shift to far right messages becoming normalized as the right has shifted further right. And we've also seen now this idea that we're heading towards a war, which is also quite a conservative idea too. I think there are links there. Interesting in how our media works. Sorry, I just wanted to say that. Don't
No,
know
I
if
think that I
that's
think that
true or not.
no, I think that's very true, and I think also I wanted to think a bit actually as moving on to the next story. I wanted to go to France, if I may, just to talk a little bit about how the media works there as well, because the way in which these narratives get shaped, as you say, far right ideas almost become commonsensical in the UK
Mm,
now over the course of the last
mm,
10 years. I think we've got a story on the website and encourage people to read it from our comrades at Basta, which we've reproduced. And the title of it's on the front page, you can find it. Killing of neo-Nazi in Leon, anti-fascism is now being exploited. And for those who haven't followed the story, a guy called Quentin Duranc was killed on February the 14th. And he was a far right activist, neo-Nazi, and he was killed in Lyon, and allegedly killed in a confrontation between anti-fascists and fascists, essentially. Um, and there's not really any question over who he was. He's been pictured wearing neo-Nazi t-shirts and so on and so forth, and he was involved in escorting some far right folks who were planning to cause some problems at a particular political gathering, left-wing political gathering. So essentially street violence. He's died. But the interesting thing that's come out of that is been the way in which there's been a huge swing in France to narrativize the left as the enemy, as the real enemy. Now, clearly, in French politics, with the rise of National Rally and all the rest of it, there's been a long road to here. It's not happened yesterday. It's happened over a long period of time. Um, and there's been a demonization of the left and of anti-fascism in general. And I don't think France is in any way unique in that. You go to Canada, for instance. Canada got obsessed with having the memorial to the victims of fascism and communism or something. Wanted to equate the two things the same. So this is happening across the world. But I think one of the things, Frustration magazine in France has also carried a really interesting story about Macronism and how Macronism has been really culpable in this, in that Macron has been trying to rehabilitate Philippe Pétain, who was obviously the Vichy leader. I've been trying to argue essentially using some of the language some Macronist candidates have started to use the language of the Vichy regime and so on,
mm,
to try and triangulate the right in France. So to your point about far right stuff being mainstreamed in the UK, it's definitely happening in France as well, albeit modulated through a different historical experience, because obviously the spectre of Vichy and so on. And it's really inflammatory there. But it's fascinating to me that, like, in both places, in very different ways, but still the same outcome. When all evidence points to the contrary, the left are narrativized as the enemy, and the centre colludes in that. Now, to be fair, going back to the comments earlier about right-wing social democratic parties, because say centrist parties in general, this
mm,
is what they do. They
mm.
triangulate. When they triangulate, they move right. They never move left. But I think the situation in France is very febrile at the moment, and it's worrying to think of what will happen in France moving forwards. But it's not dissimilar. This idea the left should not be allowed in public life. And obviously an individual has died. But there have been, I think, in frustration, the piece that they ran on it, they ran articles, they ran an account of several people on the other side who've obviously been subjected to violence and so on, and the disproportionate level of treatment casualties get when they're from one side versus the other. So yeah, it's worrying times,
Yeah,
certainly in France.
yeah. It's interesting how those things are happening across national borders, but in slightly different ways. The same phenomenon occurs, and because of the different cultures and the different politics, they occur in slightly different ways, but you can see the pattern. And it's a pattern that's been going on for a long time, really, I think. Do you want me to carry on talking?
No, absolutely. I was trying to find my mute button. I've just been chided on YouTube for going to Nando's, but thanks for the tip. I didn't know that, and I won't. So thank you. I appreciate that, comrade. Always willing to learn. So thanks for that one.
I
No, I
can't
think.
remember you saying anything about Nando's. What was
Oh,
that?
I just mentioned there was a Nando's in Portsmouth. That's all. But
Oh, I see.
so
Okay.
so yeah. So no, I do appreciate that. Thank you for the tip. I do have a list of places that I don't go, so I can go on that list. That's fantastic. Thanks for the tip. Yeah, no, just I was also just looking at the comments as well. Comrade makes the point. About Canada applauding a Ukrainian veteran,
Mm,
Waffen SS veteran.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There was no due diligence done on these individuals. You're thinking, well, hang on a minute. If you're an anti-communist in Ukraine in 1943, whose side were you fighting on? None of that was done because the need was there to demonize the left. So yeah, as you said, these patterns are happening, as we say, in different
Mm,
ways, in different places, but there's a universal kind of drive to
yeah,
basically just demonize the left out of politics at the moment.
indeed.
Um, and cheerful thoughts. We're always full of positive thoughts. I mean, but they're just thinking about the French situation in particular. I think one of the real challenges for that is when you compare it to Britain. The argument for Macronism was very similar to the argument we're seeing against reform.
Mm,
It's me or them.
yeah,
And you're seeing how that's playing out in France, right?
yeah.
And in very similar ways, like you say, in very similar ways, Macron is adopting that language in order to triangulate. So you become the thing that you're supposed to be opposing. Labour has done the same thing here. It's obviously the Democrats in the US have done similar things in vis-a-vis the Republicans. The Democrats, for example, quite recently wouldn't vote to defund ICE. You would think that would be a no-brainer. If you look at the polling data in the US,
Mm.
ICE is actually hugely unpopular. And yet, the National Democratic Party couldn't find it in itself to defund that organization, even after what happened in Minnesota and elsewhere. So they just don't seem to have the capacity, the centre, to think differently in any way, shape, or form. This is
Well, I
just
think,
we're on this road, and this is where we're going.
one of the things that happens with these people that are more or less liberal is that they have a very strong belief in the institutions. And so the idea of attacking the institutions is difficult for them. And I think that's true of the Democrats, but it would be true of Starmer as well, in certain circumstances. Um, because there's a genuine belief there that government is necessary. So the Democrats in the US are in a tricky position because you've got a Republican president who just cares about power, and you've got them who really actually care about the system. And so they don't want to come across as attacking the system. So they're not going to be the solution, are they, in terms of reforming institutions? They're going to they're going to have that battle internally to even get to the point where they're willing to say we want to reform institutions and have enough power to do it. So they're in a kind of odd position. But I was just thinking while you were talking about us all as anarchists and how frustrating these really big issues are, in the fact that I often feel helpless, and I don't know if other people feel helpless. Like, how do we how do we even combat this stuff? How do we even come to terms with it, deal with it? We've talked about some really serious stuff where, just thinking just about the Spycops, the stuff that people have been through with that, where they've formed relationships with people who were spying on them and their comrades, and even having children with such people. Like, how do you even begin to process that sort of thing if you're a victim of that? I have no idea. My full respect for people who have gone through it. As individuals, we sometimes just feel completely helpless and we can't do anything. And I just wonder what we can say about that to bring a bit of hope to the end of the news review.
No, I think the risk of being trite. I'm not going to say anything spectacularly original, unsurprisingly, but I think at the risk of being trite. I mean, for me personally, speaking for myself, obviously, in anarchism, what I find so beautiful about anarchism, the beautiful idea, as we call it,
Mm,
is how well it harmonizes the individual and the collective. I find, obviously, there's many different schools of anarchism. There's lots of different ways you can approach anarchism.
mm,
But the fact that it sees the individual and the collective as inextricably connected and and constituted by each other.
yeah.
Um, and so I find it really helpful just to, take Colin Ward, for instance. My anarchism's a bit different to Colin Ward's. I mean, we're both anarcho-communists, if we want the technical description, but my way of doing things is probably slightly different to Colin Ward's. But if you do read Anarchy in Action, it is I find Anarchy in Action quite a reassuring book in many ways, because yeah, you do things on the local level, you do things on the affinity group level, you build things up. Yes, it does mean that when the big ticket things happen on the international news, you're like, oh my God, how do we stop this? And maybe we're not there yet. But I think we have to be careful not to be too hard on ourselves, because I'm conscious that Martin Luther King's daughter said a little while ago that folks have done more with less, in worse circumstances at times.
Mm,
And I think, in a way, one of the virtues, and I know we both know our history. I think one of the things that gives me comfort is thinking about the fact that actually we are here now, and the ideas that we have sustained us to this point, and also they've made a really positive impact in the world in lots of different ways. And that doesn't mean that the horrors of the world are going to go away, and it's not to dismiss some of the things that you've rightly raised, like, for example, the fate of people traumatized by Spycops and the horror that is, that I could never understand because I've never been
mm,
through that. But I do think hope comes from our connections with each other. Might sound trite, but I think it makes a massive difference to me, certainly. Doesn't mean necessarily we can stop the next war. It doesn't mean we can, but we can certainly try and make our worlds better, and
mm,
then hopefully encourage and educate more people to think about the ways they can work together. And to your point that you raised earlier as well, John, I know electoral interventionism is a hot topic for anarchists, abstentionism, and I'm kind of like the way I used to be. I was raised a Catholic, right? I'm kind of like an abstentionist in the way that I used to be a Catholic, and then I'm a bad abstentionist, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is, I generally do believe in abstentionism as an idea.
mm.
But on the other hand, I also have a lot of sympathy for the choose your enemy perspective, which is I've got no time for any of them, but at the same time, I'd rather fight some of them than some of the others, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have a lot of sympathy for that argument. And yeah, so when it comes to local elections, absolutely, if there's a local candidate who's running a campaign on something, I might well support them on that. But also, there is, not that we need to invoke authorities, because that's not what we do as anarchists, but there is a really interesting line of thinking on that from Bookchin, libertarian municipalism, all that sort of stuff. I think the challenge for that sort of stuff, and not to be despondent about it, is if you do get involved in local politics and so on, where that can get limited. Obviously, we've seen things of the council elections now, but also Mamdani in New York. Obviously, he's not one of us, but he's somebody that a lot of people have got a lot of sympathy for. And I
Yeah.
think he's in that phase, isn't he? Of, well, he's got power in local politics, but he's finding out where the boundaries of that are. But just because boundaries are there doesn't mean we can't act in our own space. As anarchists, we're not running for city hall, but we
Well,
can we can develop our own spaces and keep our own spaces as free as possible, I think.
I think that's all really, really positive and good stuff. Incidentally, there is a Communist League candidate in Gorton and Denton, so watch out for him. I watched his 1 minute manifesto, and he assures me that Cuba has to be saved from the Americans, and that only supporting his party and getting a revolution for the working class will solve the problems and end the threat of a world war. So the Communist League have all of the answers that we've tried to deal with today. Watch out for how many votes he gets tomorrow on the way to a glorious Communist League victory in the future.
And just we had a reminder as you were talking there, John. We had a reminder. Yeah, I did. One of the comrades talked about Mamdani being chummy with chum for the cameras. Yeah, I didn't like that either. But
Mm.
another one of the commenters, another Dafty, has said when we're talking about things you can do, Zapatistas. There are people out there who are doing stuff all the time. And the examples, I think the other thing is somebody who is very obviously British, in my case, very obviously from a very specific place and a certain set of privileges. It's always wise to be humble as well and learn from everyone that you can. So I think we're on our hour. I think we've done about an hour.
Very
John,
well,
it's
I think.
it's it's been an absolute pleasure, mate. Thank you so
Yeah, it's good
much
to catch up with you, man.
for coming on. Folks, thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. We'll see what emerges from Manchester. Hopefully, we won't have another war in the Middle East by next week. We'll see what happens, but hopefully that won't happen. But look after each other, stay safe, and solidarity. Thanks, everyone.